In the gaslit shadows of Victorian London, where nobility and brutality danced an eternal waltz, they said the deadliest blade belonged not to the acclaimed duelists of the gentlemen's clubs, but to a ghost, a shadow who moved through high society's gilded halls with a paintbrush in hand and steel in her heart. They called her the shadow artist, though few knew her true name, and fewer still lived to speak of her skill with a blade. This is the story of Isabella Clarke, whose paintings captured the soul of London's elite, and whose sword had sent more than a dozen men to their graves. Join me today as we delve into the tale of the woman they called the shadow artist, who proved that the most lethal predator is often the one hiding in plain sight. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's video will reveal another dark secret from Victorian London's deadliest corners. London, 1875. The fog rolled thick and heavy off the Thames, turning the city's grand boulevards into canyons of shadow and secrets. The gaslight's glow created halos in the mist, each one a small island of illumination in the growing darkness. It was on such an evening that Thomas Blackwood and his ruffians first encountered the quiet artist who would later seal their fates. The Silver Swan Gallery on Berkeley Square had become the talk of London's art world, though not for its usual displays of pastoral landscapes and noble portraits. Instead, whispers spread about the mysterious new artist whose works seemed to capture more than mere appearance. They revealed the very souls of their subjects. Some claimed the paintings could make a guilty man confess his sins, while others swore they saw movement in the shadows of the canvases when no one was watching. Isabella Clarke worked in silence, her brush moving with the same precise grace that had once guided her blade through the air in her father's secret training room in Florence. The gallery's owner, Frederick Morton, had given her the entire east wing for her studio, impressed not just by her talent, but by the wealthy clients she attracted. Those who watched her work noticed two things: the unusual way she studied her subjects, as if measuring the distance between heartbeats, and the fact that her right hand never seemed to tire, no matter how many hours she painted. What none of them knew was that same hand had won more than 30 duels in the hidden courts of Europe, earning her the name La Lama Silenciosa, the silent blade, before she vanished from the continent's dueling circles. Now she wielded a brush instead of a sword, though the rapier that had served her so well lay hidden beneath the floorboards of her studio, wrapped in silk and memories. Thomas Blackwood was everything Isabella was not: loud, crude, and proud of his reputation as Berkeley Square's resident bully. His father's shipping fortune had bought him entry into London's upper circles, but money couldn't purchase the refinement he lacked. He and his band of similarly privileged ruffians had made sport of tormenting the area's shopkeepers and artists, demanding protection payments with the casual cruelty of men who had never faced consequences. The first time Blackwood entered the Silver Swan, Isabella was working on a commission for Lady Montgomery, her brush capturing the subtle play of light across the noblewoman's features. He swaggered through the gallery, his walking stick tapping against priceless frames, making crude remarks about the artwork while his companions laughed sycophantically. Well, he drawled, stopping before Isabella's workspace. What have we here? Another foreigner come to profit from London's generosity? His shadow fell across her canvas like a stain. Isabella continued painting, her movements unhurried. Those who knew her in her previous life would have recognized the dangerous calm in her posture, the same stillness that preceded lightning-fast strikes in moonlit dueling grounds. "I'm speaking to you, girl," Blackwood snapped, his walking stick suddenly pressed against her easel. "It's proper manners to acknowledge your betters." The brush paused, hovering above the canvas like a conductor's baton frozen mid-movement. Isabella turned slowly, her dark eyes meeting Blackwood's with an intensity that made him step back involuntarily. She spoke softly, her Italian accent barely noticeable after years in England. "I acknowledge them when I meet them, sir." The silence that followed Isabella's words seemed to crystallize in the air, delicate and dangerous as frost. Blackwood's face flushed red, unused to such direct challenge, especially from a woman. His companions shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Frederick Morton, watching from the gallery's entrance, felt his heart skip a beat. He'd invested too much in his new artist to lose her to Blackwood's notorious temper. "Perhaps," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "You don't understand how things work in Berkeley Square." He leaned closer, his expensive cologne unable to mask the whiskey on his breath. "Every business here pays for protection. Every. Single. One." Isabella's brush never trembled as she returned to her painting, adding a subtle shadow to Lady Montgomery's jaw. "How fascinating," she murmured, "that you believe I need protection." Lady Montgomery, still posed in her chair, couldn't suppress a small smile. She'd heard rumors about Isabella's peculiar confidence, the way she seemed unaffected by the threats and schemes that usually plagued foreign artists in London. Some attributed it to naivety, others to arrogance. But there was something in the artist's posture that suggested neither, a coiled readiness that reminded the noblewoman of her late husband, a celebrated cavalry officer. Blackwood's walking stick moved with sudden violence, knocking the palette from Isabella's hand. Paint splattered across the floor like drops of blood on the polished wood. "Clumsy of you," he sneered. "Accidents happen so easily in this city, especially to those who don't appreciate proper business arrangements." Isabella set her brush down with deliberate care, her movements precise as a surgeon's. She turned to face Blackwood fully, and something in her gaze made his companions take an instinctive step backward. For a moment, the careful facade of the quiet artist flickered, and beneath it lurked something that had made Italian nobles tremble. "I have seen proper business arrangements, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. "I have seen them conducted with honor in Florence, with dignity in Paris, and with respect in Vienna." She stood, her slight frame somehow filling the space between them. "What you offer is nothing but common thuggery dressed in expensive clothes." Frederick Morton moved to intervene, but Lady Montgomery raised a hand to stop him. The noblewoman had seen enough conflicts among the ton to recognize when deeper currents were moving beneath the surface. There was something about Isabella's stance that spoke of complete confidence, not the false bravado of youth, but the absolute certainty of someone who had measured their opponent and found them wanting. Blackwood's gang had grown quiet, watching their leader with nervous anticipation. They'd seen him destroy men for lesser insults, seen businesses burned and lives ruined for the mere suggestion of defiance. But something about the situation felt different. The usual script had gone awry, like actors suddenly discovering they were in a different play entirely. "You have 1 week," Blackwood snarled, trying to reassert control of the situation. "1 week to reconsider your position. After that—" He let the threat hang in the air, tapping his walking stick against his polished boot. 7 days, Isabella agreed, turning back to her canvas. "More than enough time for you to reconsider yours." As Blackwood and his men stormed out of the gallery, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors, Lady Montgomery finally released the breath she'd been holding. "My dear," she said, adjusting her pose, "I do believe you've just made a rather dangerous enemy." Isabella's brush returned to its work, adding depth to the shadows behind the noblewoman. "No, my lady," she replied quietly. "I've merely reminded an old one why he should fear the dark." Frederick Morton began cleaning up the spilled paint, his hands trembling slightly. "Miss Clarke, if you wish to withdraw from your commitments here, I would understand completely." "Blackwood, he has influence. Connections. His father's money cannot buy him skill," Isabella interrupted, her eyes never leaving the canvas. "Nor can it teach him honor." Her brush moved with renewed purpose, and those watching closely might have noticed she was darkening the shadows in her painting, creating depths that seemed to hold secrets of their own. In her studio that evening, after the gallery had closed and the gas lamps cast their wavering light through the fog, Isabella knelt on the floor and carefully lifted the loose board where she kept her past hidden. The rapier, when she unwrapped it from its silk shroud, caught the lamplight like a sliver of frozen lightning. 7 days, she thought, running a finger along the blade's perfect edge. 7 days before London discovered why the dueling courts of Europe still whispered her name in the dark. Word of the confrontation at the Silver Swan spread through London's art circles like wildfire. By nightfall, every salon and gentleman's club buzzed with whispers about the foreign artist who had dared to defy Thomas Blackwood. Some praised her courage, others condemned her foolishness, but all waited with bated breath to see how the drama would unfold. At his private club on St. James Street, Blackwood nursed his wounded pride with expensive brandy. His closest companion, James Rutherford, watched with growing concern as his friend's mood darkened with each glass. "Perhaps," Rutherford suggested carefully, "we should look into this woman's background before proceeding further." Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "A paint-stained foreigner? What's to know?" He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the lamplight. "Though I must admit, there was something familiar about her stance, like a fencer at ready." In the shadows of the club's reading room, an elderly gentleman named Victor Caldwell lowered his newspaper. His interest piqued. He had spent years as Britain's cultural attaché in Florence, and recognized the name Isabella Clarke from whispered conversations in Italian dueling circles. But surely, he thought, it couldn't be the same woman. La Lama Silenziosa had vanished years ago, after that bloody night in Venice when 3 of Italy's finest swordsmen had met their end, under mysterious circumstances. Back at her modest apartment above a bookshop in Bloomsbury, Isabella was entertaining an unexpected visitor. Lady Montgomery had arrived unannounced, her carriage drawing curious glances from the neighbors. "You must forgive my intrusion," the noblewoman said, accepting a cup of tea, "but I felt compelled to warn you. My late husband's brother sits on the board of Blackwood Shipping. That young man's father. He's not someone to be trifled with." Isabella's smile held secrets older than her years. "The wolf does not fear the merchant's son merely because he wears fine clothes, my lady." She paused, studying her guest carefully. "But I sense you're here for more than warnings." Lady Montgomery set down her cup with a soft clink. "There are rumors," she said carefully, "about a series of duels in Vienna 3 years ago. A visiting English lord, drunk and cruel, insulting a young Italian girl at the opera. The next morning, they found him in the Prater, bleeding but alive, with a perfect scar across his cheek." Her eyes met Isabella's. "My husband was there that season. He said the lord's technique was flawless, yet his opponent moved like living shadow." Isabella remained silent, but her right hand moved unconsciously to touch her left sleeve, where a thin scar marked her only defeat, a reminder from her earliest days of training. "The past," she finally said, "is a different country, my lady. I merely paint portraits now." "Of course," Lady Montgomery smiled, rising to leave. At the door, she paused. "Though I must say, your painting captures the most remarkable shadows, almost as if they're hiding something. Or someone." After her visitor's departure, Isabella returned to her studio at the gallery. The night watchman, used to her odd hours, merely nodded as she passed. In the large room, her unfinished paintings watched like silent sentinels as she moved to a blank canvas. Her brush moved with purpose, but tonight she wasn't creating another portrait for London's elite. Instead, dark shapes emerged on the white surface, the outline of a dueling ground, the suggestion of drawn blades, figures locked in eternal combat. She painted through the night, and as dawn approached, the canvas told a story few in London would understand. It was both confession and declaration, a message meant for those who knew where to look. In the growing light, the painted shadows seemed to move, and in their depths, a warning waited for those foolish enough to mistake an artist's grace for weakness. 6 days remained until Blackwood's deadline, and already the pieces were moving on a board far larger than the young ruffian could imagine. In her father's secret training room in Florence, Isabella had learned more than just swordplay. She had learned patience, strategy, and the art of letting an opponent's arrogance become their downfall. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Silver Swan Gallery. Victor Caldwell, his silver hair and immaculate dress marking him as a gentleman of the old school, moved through the gallery with the measured pace of someone who understood the value of patience. He paused before each of Isabella's paintings, studying them with the keen eye of a man accustomed to looking beneath surfaces. Isabella was working on a new commission when she felt his presence at her studio door. Without turning, she spoke softly in perfect Italian. I wondered if any of the old guard would recognize me. "The shadows in your paintings," Caldwell replied in the same language. "They have a particular quality. Like the darkness just before dawn in the Boboli Gardens." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Where many young nobles learned the true meaning of honor." Isabella's brush never hesitated as she continued working. "You were there that night, weren't you, in Venice, behind the Doge's palace?" "As cultural attaché, it was my duty to investigate when 3 prominent nobles were found wounded at dawn." His tone held no accusation, merely curiosity. "They refused to name their opponent, but the cuts—" He paused, studying her technique. "Precise. Artistic, one might say. Like brush strokes on canvas." Meanwhile, across London, Thomas Blackwood was conducting his own investigations. His inquiries had led him to a small Italian coffee house in Soho, where an expatriate named Marco Rossi claimed to have information about the mysterious artist. "La lama silenziosa," Rossi whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "The silent blade. They say she never spoke during her duels, just appeared like a ghost at dawn, delivered her judgment and vanished. Some claim she was nobility herself. Others say she was Death's own daughter." Blackwood scoffed, but his hand tightened around his walking stick. "Fairy stories to frighten children. I'm asking about Isabella Clarke." Rossi's smile held no humor. "Signore, you do not understand. The stories, they say she never killed this silent blade. Instead, she left her opponents alive but marked, a scar to remind them of their sins." He leaned forward, his voice dropping further. "And always, always she would paint their portrait first, as if studying their soul before passing judgment." Back at the gallery, Caldwell had moved closer to Isabella's workspace. "There are those who would pay handsomely to know what really happened in Venice," he mentioned casually. "The families of those men still seek answers." Isabella finally turned to face him, her dark eyes holding shadows deeper than any in her paintings. "And what of the young girl they attacked? Did those noble families seek answers about her fate as well?" Caldwell had the grace to look away first. "You've built quite a life here," he observed, changing tactics. "It would be a shame if the past were to resurface." "The past never left, Mr. Caldwell," Isabella replied, turning back to her canvas. "It simply waits, like a blade in the darkness, for the moment when it's needed again." As Caldwell left the gallery, he passed Frederick Morton, nervously pacing near the entrance. The gallery owner had spent the morning fielding increasingly aggressive inquiries about his foreign artist. Someone was asking questions in the city's darker corners, offering money for information about Isabella's movements and habits. The countdown continued. 5 days remained until Blackwood's deadline. But as the pieces moved on this elaborate board, it became increasingly unclear who was truly the hunter and who was the prey. Isabella's latest painting, still wet on the easel, showed a moonlit garden where shadows seemed to move with deadly purpose. And in the darkest corner, a figure waited with the patience of a predator who knew their quarry would eventually come to them. The 4th night brought rain to London, turning the gaslit streets into mirrors that reflected the city's restless dreams. In his study at Blackwood Manor, Thomas pored over the documents his investigators had gathered. Birth records from Florence showed an Isabella Clarke, born to an English merchant and an Italian noblewoman. But the trail grew cold after her father's death 10 years ago. It was as if she had stepped into one of her own painted shadows and vanished. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, pushing papers across his mahogany desk. James Rutherford, lounging nearby with a glass of port, raised an eyebrow. "A mere artist standing up to us? There must be more." "Perhaps," Rutherford suggested. We're approaching this wrong. Your father always says to look at the money. He picked up a document. The Silver Swan Gallery's profits have tripled since she arrived. Her paintings sell for astronomical sums, yet she lives modestly. Where does the money go? In her studio, Isabella was entertaining another unexpected visitor. The young girl couldn't have been more than 16, her clothes marking her as a servant in one of London's wealthy households. "Please," the girl whispered, wringing her hands. "Lady Montgomery said you might help. Master Richard, he thinks servants are his to do with as he pleases." Isabella's hand stilled on her canvas. "Richard Blackwood? Thomas's older brother?" The girl nodded, tears threatening. "Father says we can't go to the police. The Blackwoods own half the constables in London. But Lady Montgomery, she said you understand about men who abuse their power, said you know how to teach them lessons they don't forget." At that moment in his private club, Victor Caldwell was sharing a remarkable story with a select audience. The duel in the Boboli Gardens, he recalled, swirling brandy in his glass, was like nothing I'd ever seen. The young duke, renowned as Florence's finest blade, moved with perfect form. But his opponent, he leaned forward, his voice dropping, like watching a dance of shadows. 3 cuts, precise as a surgeon's knife. The duke lived, but his sword hand never held a blade again. The rain grew heavier as Isabella led the young servant girl to her apartment above the bookshop. Over tea served in delicate cups that had once graced her father's palazzo in Florence, she listened to tales of Richard Blackwood's cruelty. Each account struck her like a physical blow, reminding her of that night in Venice when she'd first understood that some monsters wore nobility's face. "I cannot promise anything," Isabella said softly, walking the girl to her door. "But know this. Sometimes justice wears a mask, and mercy can come from the shadows." After the girl's departure, Isabella knelt beside her hidden rapier. The blade seemed to hum with anticipation as she unwrapped it, memories flowing through her fingers like water. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "The sword is not just a weapon, Piccola. It is truth given form. In the right hands, it becomes justice itself." Across town, Thomas Blackwood was making a discovery that changed everything. In a dusty file from the British Embassy in Florence, he found a report about a series of mysterious duels that had plagued Italian nobility. Young lords who had abused their power, who had thought themselves untouchable, found themselves facing a shadow at dawn. Each survived, but each bore a mark, a single precise cut that ended their ability to harm others. The report included a detailed description of the suspected duelist. Medium height, moves with unusual grace, suspected to have training in both Italian and French schools of swordplay. Most remarkably, the individual appears to study their targets in advance, often appearing in society circles as an artist or musician. Blackwood's hand trembled as he read the last line. 4 days remained until his deadline, but suddenly he felt like the one running out of time. In her studio, Isabella added the final touches to a new painting, a dark scene of a predator becoming prey, with shadows that seemed to hold secrets and justice waiting in the dark. Dawn broke over London with reluctant grace, painting the city's spires in shades of gold and crimson. Isabella stood at her studio window, watching the interplay of light and shadow across Berkeley Square. Below, the city was awakening, unaware of the wheels now turning, the pieces moving into place like figures in an elaborate dance of steel and shadow. Frederick Morton arrived early, his face lined with worry. "Miss Clarke," he began, fidgeting with his watch chain. "There are rumors. Richard Blackwood was seen leaving his club last night, boasting about teaching a certain foreign artist proper respect. He had 6 men with him." Isabella continued preparing her paints, her movements precise and unhurried. "And did these men return with him?" Morton blinked. "Well, no. In fact, Richard himself was found unconscious in an alley near Covent Garden. The doctors say his right hand was damaged, very precisely damaged. A small smile touched Isabella's lips as she selected a brush. How unfortunate. I trust he will recover? Yes, but Morton lowered his voice. They say before he lost consciousness, he kept mumbling about shadows that moved like dancers and steel that whispered in the dark. Across London, Thomas Blackwood paced his study like a caged tiger. The attack on his brother had shattered his remaining doubts about Isabella's true identity, but rather than fear, he felt a strange exhilaration. Here, finally, was an opponent worthy of his family's full attention. Father wants to know how you plan to handle this, Rutherford reported, watching his friend's agitated movements. Richard's injury has caused quite a stir among the board members. Blackwood paused before a mirror, adjusting his cravat with deliberate care. Tell my father that by week's end, the shadow artist will be nothing but a cautionary tale. I've already sent messages to certain gentlemen who specialize in permanent solutions. In her private apartments, Lady Montgomery received a small package wrapped in black silk. Inside, she found a miniature painting no larger than her palm, a perfect rendering of Richard Blackwood's face but with shadows that seemed to predict the bruises now darkening his features. A note accompanied the gift. Justice wears many faces, my lady. Some wear paint, others wear darkness. Victor Caldwell, reading his morning paper at his club, noticed a curious advertisement in the society pages. Exhibition at the Silver Swan Gallery, Shadows of Justice, by Isabella Clarke. Special viewing 3 days hence, by invitation only. His aged hands trembled slightly as he recalled another invitation from years ago, one that had led to 3 noble houses of Venice learning harsh lessons about consequence and honor. The young servant girl Sarah returned to her duties at the Blackwood household with a newfound sense of peace. She noticed Richard's conspicuous absence at breakfast, and the way the other servants whispered about strange shadows in Covent Garden. In her apron pocket she carried a small sketch, a gift from Isabella, showing a bird breaking free from its cage. 3 days remained until Blackwood's deadline, but the dynamics had shifted. Isabella worked steadily at her easel, but now her paintings took on a different character. Each canvas seemed to hold warnings for those who knew how to read them. Scenes of predators becoming prey, of justice emerging from darkness, of consequences arriving on silent feet. You've started a war, Frederick Morton warned, watching her work. The Blackwoods don't forgive, and they never forget. Isabella's brush moved with the same precision that had marked Richard Blackwood's hand. No, Mr. Morton, she replied softly. I've simply reminded them that some wars began long before they knew they were fighting. In the growing light, her latest painting dried slowly, a scene of a dueling ground at dawn, where shadows held secrets and justice waited with infinite patience for pride to meet its inevitable fall. Dawn broke over London with reluctant grace, painting the city's spires in shades of gold and crimson. Isabella stood at her studio window, watching the interplay of light and shadow across Berkeley Square. Below, the city was awakening, unaware of the wheels now turning, the pieces moving into place like figures in an elaborate dance of steel and shadow. Frederick Morton arrived early, his face lined with worry. Miss Clarke, he began, fidgeting with his watch chain. There are rumors. Richard Blackwood was seen leaving his club last night, boasting about teaching a certain foreign artist proper respect. He had 6 men with him. Isabella continued preparing her paints, her movements precise and unhurried. And did these men return with him? Morton blinked. Well, no. In fact, Richard himself was found unconscious in an alley near Covent Garden. The doctors say his right hand was damaged. Very precisely damaged. A small smile touched Isabella's lips as she selected a brush. How unfortunate. I trust he will recover. Yes, but... Morton lowered his voice. They say before he lost consciousness, he kept mumbling about shadows that moved like dancers, and steel that whispered in the dark. Across London, Thomas Blackwood paced his study like a caged tiger. The attack on his brother had shattered his remaining doubts about Isabella's true identity. But rather than fear, he felt a strange exhilaration. Here, finally, was an opponent worthy of his family's full attention. "Father wants to know how you plan to handle this," Rutherford reported, watching his friend's agitated movements. "Richard's injury has caused quite a stir among the board members." Blackwood paused before a mirror, adjusting his cravat with deliberate care. "Tell my father that by week's end, the shadow artist will be nothing but a cautionary tale. I've already sent messages to certain gentlemen who specialize in permanent solutions." In her private apartments, Lady Montgomery received a small package wrapped in black silk. Inside, she found a miniature painting no larger than her palm. A perfect rendering of Richard Blackwood's face, but with shadows that seemed to predict the bruises now darkening his features. A note accompanied the gift. "Justice wears many faces, my lady. Some wear paint, others wear darkness." Victor Caldwell, reading his morning paper at his club, noticed a curious advertisement in the society pages. "Exhibition at the Silver Swan Gallery. Shadows of Justice by Isabella Clarke. Special viewing 3 days hence. By invitation only." His aged hands trembled slightly as he recalled another invitation from years ago, one that had led to 3 noble houses of Venice learning harsh lessons about consequence and honor. The young servant girl, Sarah, returned to her duties at the Blackwood household with a newfound sense of peace. She noticed Richard's conspicuous absence at breakfast, and the way the other servants whispered about strange shadows in Covent Garden. In her apron pocket, she carried a small sketch, a gift from Isabella, showing a bird breaking free from its cage. 3 days remained until Blackwood's deadline, but the dynamics had shifted. Isabella worked steadily at her easel, but now her paintings took on a different character. Each canvas seemed to hold warnings for those who knew how to read them, scenes of predators becoming prey, of justice emerging from darkness, of consequences arriving on silent feet. "You've started a war," Frederick Morton warned, watching her work. "The Blackwoods don't forgive, and they never forget." Isabella's brush moved with the same precision that had marked Richard Blackwood's hand. "No, Mr. Morton," she replied softly. "I've simply reminded them that some wars began long before they knew they were fighting." In the growing light, her latest painting dried slowly, a scene of a dueling ground at dawn, where shadows held secrets and justice waited with infinite patience for pride to meet its inevitable fall. The morning brought an unexpected development that sent ripples through London's artistic circles. Invitations to Isabella's exhibition, Shadows of Justice, arrived at select addresses, each one a small masterpiece of artistry, featuring a miniature painting of a dueling ground at dawn. More intriguing were the recipients, families of those who had faced the silent blade across Europe, witnesses to past judgments, and victims of noble cruelty who had found mysterious justice. Colonel Matthews, studying his invitation in his rented rooms, felt a chill of recognition. The dueling ground depicted on his card was the exact location where, 3 years ago, he had found his most promising student unconscious, his sword-hammer permanently crippled. The student who had boasted of using his skills to prey upon young women. "She's not just showing paintings," he muttered, his soldier's mind recognizing strategy. "She's gathering witnesses." Durant, the French killer, received his invitation at his club. The miniature on his card showed the garden behind the Paris Opera House, where he had once arranged accidents for wealthy patrons until a shadow had left him with a reminder of mortality, a scar that still burned in the cold. In his office at Blackwood Shipping, Thomas received a different kind of message. A small painting arrived, showing 3 wolves hunting in the dark, unaware of the trap they were walking into. The note attached read simply, "Some predators forget they can become prey." Lady Montgomery, watching the pieces move into place, paid a visit to Victor Caldwell. "You were there for all of it, weren't you?" she asked over tea. Venice, Florence, Paris, tracking the silent blade's progress across Europe. Caldwell's hands trembled slightly as he set down his cup. "Not tracking," he corrected. "Witnessing. After Venice, I understood what she was doing. Each duel was a judgment. Each scar, a sentence. She never killed. That would have been too easy. Instead, she ensured her opponents lived with the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, Isabella worked tirelessly in her studio. preparing the exhibition space. Each painting was positioned with careful precision, creating a path that visitors would follow. Frederick Morton, watching her work, began to understand the design. "It's a story," he breathed, seeing the pattern. "Each canvas leads to the next, building to something." "Everything is a story, Mr. Morton," Isabella replied, adjusting a frame. "The trick is knowing which role you play in it." As evening approached, Durant decided to reconnoiter the gallery. He found the doors unlocked and the exhibition space lit by the new gas lamps. Moving silently through the rooms, he studied each painting with growing unease. They told stories he knew, moments of justice delivered in shadow, but from angles he'd never considered. In one, he recognized himself, though his face was obscured by darkness, fleeing from an unseen opponent. The last room held only empty walls and a single easel with a covered canvas. As he approached, a voice spoke from the shadows that shouldn't have existed under the bright gas lamps. "Some men never learn." Isabella's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "They think because they cannot see the blade, it cannot find them." Durant spun, his sword cane at ready, but found only empty space. When he turned back, the covered canvas had been unveiled, showing a scene that hadn't happened yet. 3 men facing judgment in a gallery of shadows. He fled into the gathering dark, his confident stride broken. In the street, he passed Caruso and Matthews heading toward the gallery, but didn't stop to warn them. Some hunts, he was beginning to realize, were traps in disguise. One day remained until Blackwood's deadline, but time seemed to be moving to a different rhythm now. In her apartment above the bookshop, Isabella cleaned her father's rapier one final time, each movement a ritual learned in childhood. Tomorrow would bring her exhibition's opening, and with it, a reckoning that had been years in the making. The day before the exhibition dawned gray and heavy with promise of rain. Throughout London, recipients of Isabella's invitations prepared for the evening's preview, their minds filled with memories of past encounters and old scars. In their rented rooms, the 3 killers made their own preparations, checking weapons and rehearsing movements that had ended countless lives. Thomas Blackwood arrived at his office to find another painting waiting, this one showing a chessboard where shadows moved pieces unseen. His father, Augustus Blackwood, studied it with concern. "Perhaps," the elder Blackwood suggested, "we should consider another approach. This woman is making a mockery of our power," Thomas snapped. "The whole city watches to see how we respond. Tonight ends it, one way or another." At the Silver Swan, Isabella moved through the exhibition space like a conductor preparing for a symphony. Each painting had been positioned to tell part of a larger story, a story of justice served in shadow, of consequences delivered with surgical precision. Frederick Morton followed in her wake, making notes in his ledger. "The guest list?" he fretted. "It's most unusual. Representatives from every major family in London, but also others. People of no social standing, yet their invitations marked as honored guests." Isabella adjusted a frame minutely. "Every story needs its witnesses, Mr. Morton, both those who deal in power and those who suffer from its abuse." Lady Montgomery arrived early, ostensibly to view her completed portrait. She found Isabella in her studio, dressed not in her usual artist smock but in a gown of midnight blue that seemed to shift like shadows in candlelight. "You've arranged quite a gathering," the noblewoman observed. "The 3 most notorious blade for hire in Europe, the city's most powerful family, and a collection of their victims. One might think you're orchestrating something rather than merely displaying art." "Art, my lady, is truth wearing a mask," Isabella replied, adding a final touch to a canvas. "Tonight, some masks will fall, and truth will have its moment in the shadows." Victor Caldwell spent the afternoon writing letters, sealing each with his official diplomatic stamp. "To be delivered," he instructed his servant, "only if I do not return from tonight's exhibition." His hands, normally so steady, trembled slightly as he remembered other galleries, other nights when art and blood had mingled in the dark. In the city's shadowy corners, Marco Rossi gathered his own witnesses, immigrants and servants who had seen the silent blades work firsthand, who knew the stories that never reached noble ears. They would attend tonight not as servants, but as witnesses to a justice long delayed. As evening approached, Durant, Caruso, and Matthews met in a private room at their hotel. "The gallery will be full," Matthews noted, studying the floor plans they'd acquired. "Dozens of witnesses." "Better," Caruso smiled coldly. "Let them see what happens to those who challenge the natural order. Let them remember their place." But Durant, still shaken from his encounter in the gallery, wasn't so certain. "She wanted us to see those paintings, wanted us to understand something." His hand unconsciously touched the scar on his neck. "What if we're not the hunters here?" The rain began as the first guests arrived at the Silver Swan. Isabella stood at the entrance, greeting each arrival with quiet grace. To some, she offered small nods of recognition. To others, gentle words of welcome. The three killers entered separately, each carrying hidden steel and deadly purpose. The exhibition was about to begin, but only Isabella knew the true performance would happen in the spaces between paintings, in the shadows that even Blackwood's new gas lamps couldn't dispel. She had spent years preparing for this moment, learning not just the art of the blade but the deeper art of justice served in darkness. The Silver Swan Gallery hummed with nervous energy as London's elite mingled with those they usually ignored. Servants stood shoulder to shoulder with nobles, all drawn into the web of Isabella's exhibition. The paintings seemed to watch the gathering crowd, their shadows deepening as the gas lamps flickered against the rain-dark windows. Thomas Blackwood arrived fashionably late, his father Augustus a commanding presence beside him. They found Isabella in the main gallery, explaining a painting to a group of mesmerized guests. The canvas showed a moonlit dueling ground where three shadows pursued a fourth, unaware that they themselves were being hunted. "Remarkable technique," Augustus commented, studying the painting. "The interplay of light and shadow. One almost feels the hunters becoming the hunted." Isabella's smile held secrets. "Art often imitates life, Mr. Blackwood, though sometimes it predicts it." Colonel Matthews positioned himself near the gallery's eastern door, while Durant took the western entrance. Caruso lingered near the center, his sword cane tapping impatiently against the polished floor. All three watched Isabella's movements with predatory focus, waiting for their moment. Lady Montgomery noticed how the guests were unconsciously arranging themselves, like pieces on a game board. The nobles and their hired killers formed one group, while those who had suffered at their hands gathered opposite. In between, Isabella's paintings told stories of justice served in shadow. "Watch closely," Victor Caldwell whispered to her. "She's not just displaying art, she's staging a revelation." Isabella moved through the crowd with fluid grace, her midnight blue gown making her seem part of her own paintings. At each canvas, she paused to explain the symbolism, the deeper meanings hidden in shadow and light. But certain guests, those who had felt the Silent Blade's judgment, recognized the scenes for what they were, moments when justice had found those who thought themselves beyond its reach. "This one," she said, stopping before a large canvas, "I call the price of power." Note how the noble figures feast while shadows gather behind them, waiting to collect old debts. Augustus Blackwood's face paled as he recognized the scene, an exact reproduction of his company's boardroom, where so many lives had been ruined with a single signature. In the painting's shadows, dark figures waited with blade-like patience. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the gallery's skylights. Thomas Blackwood felt control of the situation slipping away. Each painting seemed to expose another of his family's carefully hidden sins. Each shadow held another accusation. "Enough of this farce," he snarled, moving toward Isabella. "You think your pretty pictures can frighten us, that your theatrical shadows can shake the Blackwood name?" Isabella turned to face him, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent gallery. "Pictures are just reflections, Mr. Blackwood, like the reflection of a blade in darkness or the mirror of consequences held up to those who thought themselves beyond justice." Durant felt it first, the subtle shift in the air that every experienced duelist learns to recognize. The gas lamps seemed to dim, though none had been adjusted. The shadows cast by Isabella's paintings began to move, or perhaps it was just the rain light playing tricks on overstrained nerves. "Now," Thomas commanded, and his 3 killers moved forward, hands reaching for hidden weapons. But Isabella remained perfectly still, a small smile playing at her lips. "Did you really think," she asked softly, "that I would arrange this gathering, invite these witnesses, and not prepare for violence?" She gestured to the shadows around them. "Look again, gentlemen. Count the shadows. Count the blades." And in that moment, as a lightning flashed outside, the gathered witnesses saw what the killers had missed. Other figures emerging from the darkness between paintings, each bearing steel that gleamed dully in the gaslight. These were not the victims of noble cruelty, but rather those who, like Isabella, had learned to turn shadow and blade into instruments of justice. Lightning flashed again, illuminating faces both familiar and strange among Isabella's defenders. A woman Durant had once hunted in Paris, now holding steel with deadly confidence. A young Italian nobleman Caruso had thought long dead, bearing a scar that marked him as one who had learned the silent blade's lessons. Even a former British officer Matthews had dismissed from his regiment, who had found new purpose in shadow and justice. "You see," Isabella said softly, her voice carrying in the tense silence, "every story has its witnesses. Every judgment creates ripples. Those you thought broken became stronger. Those you thought silenced found new voices." Thomas Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "Kill her," he commanded, but his killers hesitated, suddenly uncertain of their odds. Caruso moved first, his sword cane flashing free in a deadly arc. But Isabella wasn't there. She moved like smoke, like one of her own painted shadows. The Italian's blade cut empty air as she slipped past his guard, her own rapier appearing as if conjured from darkness. "You never learned, Vincenzo," she whispered, close enough for only him to hear. "Mercy, once offered, rarely comes twice." Durant and Matthews tried to flank her, but Isabella's defenders moved with practiced coordination, separating the killers from each other. The gallery erupted into controlled chaos as steel met steel in the spaces between paintings. Augustus Blackwood watched in horror as his carefully constructed plan collapsed. Each of Isabella's allies moved with the same fluid grace she possessed, turning the exhibition space into a deadly dance floor where justice finally met privilege. Lady Montgomery observed it all from near the entrance, her face showing grim satisfaction. "Rather fitting," she remarked to Caldwell, "that their judgment should come in a gallery of their own sins." Durant fell first, his legendary speed meaning nothing against opponents who moved like living shadows. A precise cut, similar to the one he'd received in Paris, ended his fight. Matthews backed away from his attacker, recognizing in her eyes the same determination he'd once dismissed in female recruits. Caruso alone pressed his attack on Isabella, driven by wounded pride and old shame. Their duel wove through the gallery, past paintings that seemed to come alive with each flash of lightning. But where Caruso fought with desperate fury, Isabella moved with the calm precision of one who had choreographed every moment. "Your technique is still excellent," she commented, parrying his thrust, "but you never understood the difference between skill and justice." Thomas Blackwood, seeing his plans unraveling, drew a hidden pistol. But before he could aim, a shadow detached itself from beside a painting. Sarah, the servant girl, holding a blade with unpracticed but determined hands. The moment's distraction was all Isabella needed. Her rapier moved like quicksilver, disarming Caruso with the same move she'd used in Milan. He fell back, clutching his sword hand as Isabella turned to face the Blackwoods. "This is impossible," Thomas sputtered, his pistol wavering between multiple targets. "You're just an artist, a foreign nobody." "No," Isabella corrected, her voice carrying to every corner of the gallery. "I am what you and your kind created. Justice that learned to paint in shadows, mercy that learned to speak with steel." The rain drummed against the skylights, nature itself providing rhythm to this deadly ballet. Isabella's allies had disarmed or disabled all opposition, moving with the coordinated grace of those who had trained together in secret, waiting for this moment. Now, Isabella continued, addressing the gathered witnesses as much as her opponents, we will discuss new arrangements for Berkeley Square, terms that include protection for the vulnerable, not the powerful. Thomas Blackwood, his face ashen, recognized the tone of someone who held not just the advantage, but the absolute certainty of victory. In the gallery's shadows, more figures emerged, servants, workers, all those his family had thought too insignificant to notice, too powerless to matter. The aftermath of the gallery confrontation rippled through London's high society, like stones cast in still water. By morning, rumors flew through gentlemen's clubs and servants' quarters alike. Tales of shadow warriors emerging from paintings, of justice delivered with surgical precision, of the Blackwood family's power broken not by force but by revelation. In the gallery's quiet aftermath, Isabella moved among her allies, checking wounds and offering quiet words of thanks. Each had their own story, their own reason for joining her shadow crusade. The woman from Paris, Marie, had rebuilt herself from the ruins Durant had left her in, training in secret with Isabella for 2 years. The Italian nobleman, Antonio, had learned to turn his scar into strength, gathering evidence of corruption in his own family. You gave us more than justice, Marie told Isabella, cleaning her blade with practiced care. You gave us purpose. Lady Montgomery surveyed the gallery where Frederick Morton was already overseeing repairs. The paintings seemed different now, no longer just accusations, but testimonies to transformation. What happens now? She asked Isabella. Surely, the Blackwoods won't simply accept this defeat. Isabella's smile held both satisfaction and warning. They'll accept it because they have no choice. Victor, would you be so kind? Caldwell stepped forward, producing a leather portfolio. Sworn testimonies, he explained, from witnesses across Europe. Every crime, every abuse of power, every dark deed the Blackwoods and their allies thought hidden. Enough to ruin not just their reputation, but their empire. Thomas Blackwood, still present and now thoroughly shaken, understood the trap's true depth. You were never just painting portraits, he said quietly. You were gathering evidence. Every commission, every society event. Art reveals truth, Isabella replied, leading him to a specific painting. Look closely, Mr. Blackwood. This scene from your company's boardroom. Note the documents visible on the table. Your signature authorizing the removal of evidence about the factory fire. 12 workers died, as I recall. Thomas Blackwood, his previous arrogance shattered, watched as his hired killers were led away by Isabella's shadows. Durant and Matthews would face justice in France and England respectively, while Caruso found himself confronting his own painted sins. You'll destroy everything, Thomas protested weakly. Hundreds depend on Blackwood shipping for their livelihood. No, Isabella corrected, her voice firm but not unkind. Your workers will find their conditions mysteriously improved. Your profits will become their fair wages. Your power will transform into protection for those who truly need it. She turned to Augustus. Unless, of course, you prefer I release these documents to every newspaper in London. The elder Blackwood, a businessman to his core, recognized negotiations' inevitability. What are your terms? As dawn approached, the gallery slowly emptied. Isabella's allies melted back into London's shadows, returning to lives forever changed by her teaching. Sarah, the servant girl who had helped trap Thomas, found herself appointed as the gallery's new assistant, her natural eye for detail finally appreciated. Lady Montgomery lingered, watching Isabella add final touches to a new painting. This one showing not shadow and judgment but light, breaking through storm clouds. Will you stay in London? The noblewoman asked. Now that your work here is done? Isabella stepped back, studying her canvas. There are other cities, other powers that need reminder of justice's reach. But first, she smiled, her brush adding a subtle highlight to the emerging light. I believe I still owe you a completed portrait. In their separate cells, the three defeated killers nursed their wounds and their shame. Each bore a new scar, precise, surgical, a signature they recognized from their first encounters with the silent blade. But unlike those initial marks of judgment, these spoke not just of punishment, but of transformation's possibility. The rain had finally stopped over Berkeley Square, and in its wake, the city seemed somehow cleaner. The Silver Swan Gallery's windows gleamed in the morning light, its shadows now holding not secrets of vengeance but promises of change. In the weeks that followed, London witnessed subtle but significant changes. Blackwood Shipping's board of directors underwent a mysterious reformation, with new members representing workers' interests suddenly appointed to prominent positions. Factory conditions improved dramatically, while corrupt managers found themselves quietly but firmly replaced. Isabella's exhibition remained open, drawing crowds who whispered about the painting's uncanny ability to reveal hidden truths. But the artist herself seemed to fade into the background once more, working on commissioned portraits with the same quiet dedication that had marked her arrival in Berkeley Square. Victor Caldwell, reviewing reports from his continental contacts, smiled at the ripple effects spreading through European society. Noble houses that had once terrorized their servants now found themselves under scrutiny from shadows that moved with painted grace. The Silent Blade students had learned their lessons well. "You've created something remarkable," he told Isabella one evening in her studio. "Not just justice, but a network of guardians." Isabella added subtle shadows to her latest work, Lady Montgomery's finally completed portrait. "Every city needs its protectors," she replied softly. "Those who understand that true power lies not in cruelty, but in the choice to defend others." The three defeated killers faced varied fates. Durant, extradited to France, found himself confronting a judiciary suddenly interested in old cases. Matthews faced court-martial for long-buried crimes, his former victims now unafraid to testify. Caruso, perhaps most transformed, approached Isabella with an unexpected request. "Teach me," he said simply, his former arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Not the blade. I've had enough of violence. Teach me to see as you do, to understand justice's deeper currents." In the servant quarters across London, Sarah's story spread like wildfire. The girl who helped trap Thomas Blackwood, now rising through the gallery's ranks. Her example inspired others to stand straighter, to watch more carefully, to realize that change was possible even in society's deepest shadows. Lady Montgomery hosted a dinner where Isabella was the guest of honor, though few understood the true significance. The gathered nobles, many of whom had sat for portraits, unconsciously touched old scars or adjusted cravats hiding marks of past judgments. "They say there's talk of revolution in Europe," one lord commented nervously. "Workers demanding rights, servants forgetting their place." "Perhaps," Isabella replied, sipping her wine. "They simply remember that every shadow holds the possibility of justice." Frederick Morton, now managing a thriving gallery, noticed how his artists' paintings had evolved. While they still held shadows, they also showed more light, dawn breaking over dueling grounds, sunshine penetrating dark corners, hope emerging from darkness. "You're not leaving, are you?" he asked one morning, recognizing signs of completion in her work. "London needs its shadow artist." Isabella smiled, adding a final brushstroke to Lady Montgomery's portrait. "London has its protectors now," she said softly. "In every servant's quarter, every factory floor, every shadowed corner where power once thought itself absolute." The Blackwoods, true to their business nature, adapted to the new reality. Augustus, perhaps secretly relieved to shed the weight of decades of corruption, focused on legitimate enterprises. Thomas, his pride severely wounded, departed for the colonies, leaving behind a city that would no longer tolerate his kind of privilege. But In quiet moments, those who had witnessed the gallery's confrontation remembered something more than just justice served. They remembered the artwork itself, how each painting had seemed to capture not just images, but moments of transformation, how shadows had come alive with purpose, and how a single artist had reminded London that true power lay not in cruelty or control, but in the choice to stand against darkness. And in her studio, Isabella continued to paint, her brush moving with the same precision that had once guided her blade. But now her artwork spoke not just of judgment, but of possibility, of a world where shadows protected the innocent, and where justice wore not just a blade's edge but also an artist's soul. 1 year after the gallery confrontation, London's autumn mists once again shrouded Berkeley Square in memorable mystery. The Silver Swan Gallery had become more than just an exhibition space. It was a symbol of transformation, a place where art and justice had become inexplicably intertwined in the public imagination. Isabella's final exhibition opened on a cool October evening, drawing crowds that included both nobility and working class, all eager to see the shadow artist's last London works. The paintings told stories of change, factories where light now penetrated once darkened corners, boardrooms where power had learned to bow to responsibility, streets where shadows protected rather than threatened. "You were right, Bang," Victor Caldwell told her, studying a painting that showed dawn breaking over London's skyline. The city did need more than just justice. It needed hope. Lady Montgomery, now a close confidant, watched the crowds move through the gallery. Former victims stood proudly alongside reformed oppressors, while Isabella's network of shadows, her students and allies, mingled unseen among them, ensuring her legacy would continue. "Venice calls," Isabella said, softly, adjusting a frame that showed a canal at twilight. "There are other cities that need reminding of justice's reach." Sarah, no longer a timid servant, but the gallery's respected assistant curator, organized the exhibition with confident precision. Under her guidance, the Silver Swan had become a gathering place for those seeking both art and justice. Her own small paintings, created under Isabella's tutelage, showed promising shadows of their own. Caruso, transformed from killer to student of art, had found his own path to redemption. His paintings, hung in a small corner of the gallery, captured moments of change, a sword laid down, a hand extended in help rather than harm, dawn light touching the faces of those who had chosen to transform rather than destroy. "Each city has its own shadows," Isabella told her gathered allies on her last night in London. "Its own need for those who will stand between power and innocence. I've shown you the way. Now the choice to continue is yours." The Blackwood name remained in London, but transformed. Augustus had handed control of the company to a board that included worker representatives, while the family's former enforcers had been replaced by those who protected rather than intimidated. The change sent ripples through London's business world, showing other powerful families a new way forward. In her final painting for the Silver Swan, Isabella captured the gallery itself, but with a subtle difference. The shadows in the artwork didn't lurk or threaten. They danced, they protected, they transformed. And in the corner, almost hidden unless one knew where to look, a small figure held both brush and blade, reminding viewers that justice could wear many faces. Frederick Morton received her resignation with understanding, though his eyes glistened suspiciously. "The shadow artist may leave," he said, "but her shadows remain, don't they?" "Look for me in the changes," she replied, touching the frame of her last work. "In the light that reaches dark corners, in the power that bows to justice, in the art that reveals truth." On her last morning in London, Isabella visited her old studio one final time. The hidden compartment beneath the floorboards was empty now, her father's rapier packed away for new battles in distant cities. But she had left something in its place, a small painting showing a young girl holding a brush, surrounded by protective shadows. "For those who need to remember," she wrote on its back, "that art and justice are two edges of the same blade." As her carriage departed Berkeley Square, the morning fog parted briefly, revealing a changed London. The city's shadows remained, but they were different now. Alive, with purpose. Sworn to protect rather than threaten. The silent blade had transformed them into guardians, just as she had transformed herself from avenging angel to artist of justice. And in galleries and shadows across Europe, whispers spread of a painter who captured more than just images, who revealed the truth behind power's masks, and whose art reminded the mighty that justice could come wielding either blade or brush, but it would always, inevitably, come. If you've enjoyed this story of art and justice, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from history's shadows, where truth often wears a painter's smock and carries steel in its heart.